following preview was begrudgingly approved for all audiences.
You're listening to Elevator Music.
Welcome to Forward Thinking, presented by the Professional Collegiate League. I'm Ricky Vellante, and I'll be joined by my co-host David West shortly. As usual, we'll be welcoming guests challenging the status quo, doing social good, and bringing about positive change to the world, while also talking a little bit of sports. As most of us expected, this week has been a bit of a crazy one, so we wanted to bring you an especially entertaining episode. We have our first dual guest appearance, featuring Kavitha Davidson and Jessica Luther, two particularly badass writers that teamed up to co-author Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back, Dilemmas of the Modern Fan, which was recently released in September. We'll be discussing the challenges that Kavitha and Jessica have had to overcome in their careers, a range of topics from their book, especially focusing on the tensions that sports fans experience when supporting their favorite teams, as well as their routines that help them get through the day and stay at the top of their game. This is definitely one of our team's favorite episodes to date, and we think you're going to love it. If you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe Forward Thinking on your favorite podcast platform and the PCL YouTube channel. You can also get more information at thepcleague.com/forwardthinking. And welcome back to Forward Thinking. I'm Ricky Vellante, joined by my co-host David West. With us today, and for the first time, we have dual guests joining us simultaneously. We have two great sports writers and co-authors of a recent book. We've got Kavitha Davidson and Jessica Luther. Jessica and Kavitha, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
And just real quick, the name of the book, Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back, Dilemma of the Modern Fan, which we'll be getting into, and I would highly recommend. But before we get into that, what drew you to sports in the first place?
I guess I'll go first. It's Kavitha here. I grew up in New York City and didn't really have a huge sports background when I was much younger. My parents came to America in 1981 from India. They didn't know anything about sports, but my mom really fell in love with basketball when they first got here, and she fell in love with the Bernard King Knicks and then eventually Patrick Ewing. And I think we still have the VHS of Patrick Ewing's jersey retirement somewhere in my parents' house, actually. But it wasn't until 1996 when I had never been able, we couldn't afford to go to live sporting events. I'd never been to a game in person, but it was a class trip my middle school took to the home opener at Yankee Stadium. It was Yankees Royals in April of 1996. And this was the first time I'd ever been to a stadium, like I said. And I just fell in love with that experience, with being in a place surrounded by 57,000 people, all cheering for the same thing. Everyone knew all the rituals, all the chants, the roll call, everything like that. And it was this like incredible feeling of community that I had never really experienced to that scale before. And especially, being the scholarship kid at a really small private school, daughter of immigrants, like it felt like a way for me to connect to my classmates. Like especially at Yankee Stadium in the 90s, you looked around and there was people of all ages, every color, every language was being spoken, but this one like common thing for people to be rooting for was there. And it was this really beautiful thing to be a part of. And I always say that the old stadium made a sound when everyone was cheering at the same time. You could feel that sound in the pit of your stomach. And I feel like I've been chasing that visceral feeling, that sound ever since then. It was also, I will say, Andy Pettitte bobblehead day, and I still have that bobblehead.
That's lovely. I sort of have the normal generational sports fandom story that I grew up with a dad who deeply loved Florida State football. He also liked the Cowboys, but my memory is mainly it was Florida State football. And in the 80s, there was one television, so we just watched what he wanted to watch on the weekends, which is like a bunch of football. And I don't remember a time when it wasn't like that. And so sort of the story I always tell about it is that when it was time to apply to go to university, I only applied to Florida State. That was the only place that I wanted to go, and I wanted to go to watch Florida State football games. And I did, and we were great don't I was there. We won the 99 championship, and I went. It was in New Orleans. We played the Hokies, beat the Hokies. And I don't know, I have loved sports. My dad always did, and I just took to it. I mean, he taught me to play basketball in middle school, and you can't tell because we're all sitting down, but I'm 6 feet tall. And so I played middle school basketball. I was not good at it, but I liked it. And I don't know, I will watch anyone play and compete in anything. Like I will make fun of ESPN for putting cornhole on TV, but I'm absolutely the person that will watch it too. So that's always been my relationship to sports.
Any day the Hokies lose is generally a good day, as the son of a UVA alum. So for the most part,
okay.
that's a true statement. No, that's great. That's awesome. And you both write. Kavitha, you've been at ESPN. Now you're at The Athletic. Jessica, freelance, but have contributed to pretty much every major publication there is, at least in the US, that covers sports. And you've both managed to cut through in an industry that generally doesn't give women all that many opportunities. So like, what are some of the challenges that you guys have had to overcome, though, to be as successful as you are?
I mean, I think for me, it's the usual. I always say it's the usual thing of you're either the only woman in the room or you're looked at as the unicorn in the room, even in a non-professional capacity. When you're just the woman at the bar who's talking about sports, everyone kind of shifts toward you, and it's seen as this really unlikely thing. And then I think a lot of men want you to prove that you belong there. The constant feeling of not belonging in that space, like that never goes away. So you're constantly being tested on your knowledge or, random stats here and there. And then it's always, well, how did you actually get to where you were? And I think for me, both being a woman and also a woman of color, and like I said before, a daughter of immigrants, that's always been a huge part of my sports fandom, but also a huge part of the backlash against me as a sports writer. I'll always remember there was a comment on one of the columns that I wrote at Bloomberg. It was a day after Derek Jeter's last game, and it was a really purple, syrupy column about how much Derek Jeter had meant to my sports fandom. And it was probably the least controversial thing I've ever written is like, I liked Derek Jeter because I grew up as a Yankees fan in the 90s, right? And one of the comments was something to the effect of, well, Kavitha, now I understand why I disagree with everything you write. It's because you're 25. I was 25 at the time, and the daughter of Indian immigrants. And what could you possibly know about American sports? How could you come to have a job covering American sports other than, of course, affirmative action? So, I mean, those kinds of sentiments don't really go away. The industry is getting better, but particularly with women, I mean, we saw this coming up recently, the lack of us in numbers, to the lack of equality in the number of us in the industry is often taken as, well, women are naturally not as interested in sports, without any kind of discerning eye to why that might be. What about this space makes it hostile or exclusive or exclusionary toward us? And the idea that there's something evolutionary in our biologies that prevents women from loving sports, that's a really difficult thing to overcome. But like I said, I do think that that's getting better.
Yeah, I mean, Kavitha and I had different paths into this. So I kind of jumped in head first 7 years ago, straight into freelance. And the main topic that I wrote about for a while that people know me for is gendered violence in sport. And so I think one of the hardest things that I had to get used to in doing this work is just like the kind of trolling. I mean, trolling is even too nice a word for what it is. But I had to figure out, I mean, I can remember very well the column or the piece that I wrote for Vice Sports in September of 2014 about Missouri. That's when I stopped reading comments on the internet. It's been a good 6 years now. You know, I've just had some really difficult reactions to the work that I do that make you not want to do it. I mean, I recently wrote a piece with John Wertheim at SI, a second piece about the Dallas Mavericks, and the Mavericks were really angry about it, and sort of just even dealing with that. But I don't know, at the same time, that's some like super serious stuff that I've written. And on some level, it makes sense that people react very strongly to it because the topic itself is really strong and important and difficult within our society. But then like my story about this is that I once wrote a dumb piece about how Lane Kiffin was a bad coach and just was failing up all the time. And I got horrible comments on that like the sort of, oh, did you write this because Lane Kiffin won't have sex with you? Just like over and over again. So it's like, oh, I can't even write kind of this stuff either. I'm just not, I don't fit here. I'm not allowed in this space. And that every time that I publish anything, I'm preparing for that reality. Like part of the work that I do is to prepare myself mentally and emotionally for all the range of reaction to it. So it's not just doing the work, which is hard enough a lot of the time, but it's also just once you put it out there, you just like never know what you're going to get back. And sometimes it really sucks.
Right. do you ever think about the perspective of the athlete and how sometimes athletes, so I know that we would have an issue sometimes with writers who, if we felt like, okay, as long as they write pieces that don't sound like this, or if as long as they write pieces that don't sound like they know exactly what it's like, and this is how we would treat a lot of the male writers. It was like, okay, they could write within a certain framework. Do you all feel like, so the men have a framework that they can write in, and then you all feel like your framework is even smaller and tighter? But then do you ever take into account, or are you aware of that other framework that sort of the athletes create? Because I think sometimes, so we had one of our beat writers in Indiana was Candace Buckner. I think Candace is with the Washington Post now, right?
Yeah.
So, but Candace was one of the people that we all were most comfortable talking to because she knew how to represent like our side of it. And so I found players like not sympathizing with her, but when we had a choice, like, okay, if like, so for instance, with me personally, with the Donald Sterling thing, right? When that happened, Candace was the only person that I could talk to and I knew wasn't going to misrepresent my ideas in that moment, which was like right before a game. It was like something happening like right now. And she's like, David, did you hear this? And I'm like, what? She so are you aware of that context that exists for the athletes and then the writers, and then that other box that sort of you all have to fit in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it cuts both ways. On the one hand, you hear from a lot of men in the industry, not athletes, that one of the reasons that there aren't as many women in sports writing or sports journalism is because we've never played football, definitely, right?
Right.
Professionally. We can't understand what it's like to be a professional athlete. The answer that I would give to that is, frankly, most men in this industry haven't been professional athletes either. And playing in a rec league, I don't think makes you any more or less qualified to do the actual journalism work. And when you talk to athletes, I mean, not to paint all athletes with a broad brush, I think when you go into it not thinking you know what their experience is like, and that's whether you're a man or that's no matter what gender you are, right? Not thinking you know what their experience is like as an athlete is the way you actually get that story from them, and the way that you can ask the proper questions. And I think that kind of trust in source building is something that can be universal. And I also remember having a conversation with Juliette McClure, who is this amazing sports writer for the New York Times, and she said actually sometimes she thinks on the building trust with athlete front, it might help her that she's a woman, because sometimes we can be more disarming, or there's less direct competition, or it's just a friendlier conversation. So I do think that can cut both ways. I think that when you couldn't possibly understand what it's like to be an athlete because you've never been one thing, I think that comes in I've never experienced that personally from athletes that I've interviewed. I've experienced that from other men in the industry, and mostly from male fans who frankly wish that they had my job. And this as an athlete, right? A ton of and we write very athlete friendly, labor friendly pieces is how I would say that. We're extremely labor friendly in the way that we approach athletes as workers and as subjects that we cover. But you always get a ton of male fans who like they're armchair quarterbacking, and they think that because they've watched their team for 20 years, they could do this professionally for a living. They also think that they could do what you did, David, professionally for a living.
Right.
So I do think that it cuts both ways.
That's interesting. I don't like to essentialize, so I feel a little weird even saying this, but on some level, it does make me, I feel like I'm being very gendered, but this idea that like a lot of women are taught to be empathetic in ways that men aren't necessarily. Men certainly can be, but I think as a culture, we have a way that we are taught to worry all the time about how other people are feeling. I spend too much time in therapy talking about trying to make sure that I'm making everyone comfortable all the time. And so I do wonder if that plays into it. That's interesting. Do you think that you felt more comfortable with Candace because she was a woman, or did that just build over time as you saw how she was reporting?
No, that's what I'm saying. It wasn't specifically because she was a woman. It was because like she knew how to represent like what we were saying and could pull out sometimes, like again, in the heat of a moment where It's like I need a quick 15 seconds. She wouldn't misrepresent. I felt like she could get that better than a lot of the other guys. And then so naturally you find yourself like, okay, if I'm going to answer this question, let me have her ask it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
She just so happened to be a woman. I mean, but I think that from my experience, I've seen most guys are distrusting of sports media because of the men, right? Like it's literally, we don't trust 9 out of the 11 in the little clutch that's moving around the locker room. So when you find people that can represent, sort of your words, represent, sort of your ambitions, I mean, you give them the benefit of the doubt, over other folks.
Yeah.
I think it's natural for athletes, for frankly any subject that is being covered, to be distrustful of the people covering them, because you don't know how your words are good, and you should be, frankly. And I remember saying this but men in the sports industry and the sports media industry do this a lot. I remember when, Marshawn Lynch was having his whole thing, and I'm just here so I don't get fined and all of that. And there were a ton of Seahawks beat writers who were mad, who were like, no, we're here to boost his profile, and he should, this is a two-way street and all that. And I get the frustration, but it's really not a two-way street. Like, he shouldn't have any obligation to talk to us, right? And I we should not, as reporters, feel entitled to the time of the people that we are covering. So I think that there's just a mentality there that I think has also changed from old media to new media. Frankly, I think it can be a generational thing as well. But yeah, I mean, I totally understand why athletes are distrustful of us.
And we have a chapter in the book. The very middle of the book is actually a whole chapter dedicated to sports media and how not diverse it is. Like, all of media has a diversity issue, but sports takes the cake. It's like the whitest, malest version of sports or of media that exists. And there's all these studies about it. And one of the things we also know from other studies is that the more diverse anything is, the better, right? And so it makes sense that having different voices, male, female, whatever, different races, whatever it is going to make for more different kinds of questioning, better storytelling, different experiences that are going to come through. Different reporters are going to have different ways that they approach their subjects that are going to bring out different things. And that's just going to make overall media better. But sports in particular is really bad on this front. Right. And it's really slow in changing. Even though it feels different now than it did probably 10 or even 20 years ago, it's still bad overall. So that's part of it too.
Now, this is just my own ignorance, but is it so when you make the decision to become a sports journalist, are you naturally pushed towards women's sports? Like, is that the first?
So
is that how that works?
I mean, that's a really good question. Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that question, to be honest, because I think the answer to that question today would be different than it was 7 years ago when Jessica and I were breaking into the industry. Because frankly, I think more media outlets think it's worth covering women's sports today than they did back then, right? And back then wasn't even that long ago. I do think that I've never felt that pressure. I started as a sports business reporter, right? So there's kind of no real gender in that, but I did take it upon myself to write a lot of business focused pieces on why we should be covering and paying attention to women's sports more. But that was done out of my own volition. And I know that Jessica has a similar personal impetus to cover women's sports because we feel like it's undercovered.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, because when I dream about what I'd like if I could do a full-time job covering women's sports, that would be amazing. But there's almost no opportunity to do that. And in fact, when you try to cover women's sports, it can be so difficult. Like, the story I always tell about it, this was 3 years ago now. I don't know. It feels time is so strange. But I wanted to write a piece about a girls' baseball team that were the only traveling girls' baseball team in the country at the time. I don't know if that's still true. And I knew it was a good story. It was sometimes you just know. You're these are interesting characters. I wanted to go to Miami to watch them play. I knew they were going to go on the field for the Marlins game and be honored and all this stuff. And I pitched and pitched and pitched, and everyone said no, but they wouldn't just say it's because we don't want to cover girls who play baseball. So it was always something, but it always felt like BS to me. And Bleacher Report picked it up at the last minute. We were great about it. They paid for my travel, which never happens as a freelancer. They sent a video crew. So we have a great 1 minute long video with the girls in it. And the piece was huge. It was so huge that NBC Nightly News did their own segment. HBO Real Sports did their own segment. I'm still smug to this day but I could not place that story. Like it took, I pitched that story for 4 to 5 months before someone said yes. And to places that I'm not going to name them here because I'm still a freelancer, but to places you think would take them, wouldn't take them. I wouldn't take that story. So on some level, I do feel a pressure to keep up with women's sports. Like I think people would expect me to. Maybe that's but like pressure to cover it is no, because like you beg people to let you cover it, and they will not.
There also just aren't a ton of full-time jobs covering women's sports. Like it's something that you've either shifted over to do, when the beat that you're regularly on is in its off season. It's just like from a personal financial standpoint, I can name maybe 3 or 4 women who do this full time, who can support themselves on what they make.
So how excited were you all from this past summer in terms of like, we have Natalie Portman and her group, with Angel City FC. We've got Tobin Heath and Kristen Press selling the most Manchester United jerseys over the last month. We have the NWSL and WNBA were 2 of the only leagues in the country that had viewership go up, in the midst of the pandemic. Not to like in any way pigeonhole you, but like how excited were you to see that the success of the WNBA and the NWSL over the last few months?
Thrilled. Like, I feel like this is just, we've been waiting sort of for this moment. And part of what happened was they put them on TV and their TV ratings went up. Like, the thing everyone's been asking for a really long time. It's like, we saw they did the NWSL Challenge Cup and it was good enough for CBS that they then got the UEFA Champs League so that they could put that up on CBS All Access because there was enough demand for it. I always feel weird being too optimistic about women's sports because it always feels a little like you never know when the bottom's going to fall out. But the NWSL and the WNBA, the WNBA has been around a long time now, not compared to the men's leagues, but as far as women's leagues go, like it really has a history now. Like there are players in the league who are younger than the league itself, think of it that way. And the NWSL is like the longest professional women's soccer league, I think. So they really are like I'm thrilled by it. I got to go last summer to the Women's World Cup in France and experience, like, there was a Wednesday night. It was at the end of the knockout rounds, at the round robin. And it was like Argentina versus Scotland. It was actually the most exciting game that I watched, but there was no reason to go. Like there was nothing really hanging in the balance. Argentina women's soccer team, there's a whole history there. It's not they don't get the resources like the men. So even though they have this huge soccer culture there, the women don't benefit in the same way. And it was like a Wednesday night in Paris on the outskirts of Paris. And still there were so many people there just thrilled to be participating. So ever since that last summer, I've really been feeling it. And I was thrilled.
I think that there was also, and we can talk about this in other contexts as well, there was just this moment of panic when the pandemic hit about the book, about sports, about the future of sports and everything like that. And one of the things that we haven't talked about a lot is part of that panic for me was that the WNBA had just signed this new CBA and the NWSL had just signed these TV contracts. And we were just about to have this summer where we could see what would happen.
Yeah, the new sponsorships too.
The new sponsorships,
yeah.
Totally. And it felt like there was new investment. You had new commissioners with refound business minds, business acumen, like strategies coming from Deloitte to apply to making women's sports successful. And then all of sports shut down. And to see that it didn't really hamper women's sports as much as it really could have was amazing to see. And just to Jessica's point about like we now have a WNBA with players who are not older than the league, who grew up with this, right? We did an episode of my show on Sue Bird, and one of my main takeaways was that Sue Bird is part of the first generation of WNBA players who have had their entire careers, who have had 17-year careers in the WNBA, who proved that is a possible path forward for the generations coming after them. So the players who are now joining that league have the Sue Birds and the Diana Taurasi's to look back on, saying that it is possible for me to do this with the rest of my professional athletic career.
Exactly. Yeah, it was very exciting to see. And as a Manchester United fan, I couldn't be more excited that Tobin Heath is there. So,
can I also just add that the WNBA was spectacular. I mean, one of the things that's happening too is there's only 12 teams. They need to be bigger, but there's only 12 teams. So the play itself is wonderful. Like, it's so hard to get into the league itself. The play gets better every year. And then this year, the dedication of the entire season to Say Her Name and to Breonna Taylor in particular. I just really love the WNBA for the organizing that they do as a group. They're the leaders on this front. And then to pair that up with the fact that their ratings went up, bless those women for creating that entire ecosystem there where like we can point to them as the counterexample for all the people who want to tell us about the NBA and their ratings and blah, 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 blah. We have the WNBA as the counterpoint to that. And the work they're doing is just like, it's just so incredibly important at the same time that they're playing spectacular basketball.
And it's so impressive too, because they do it, like when the Milwaukee Bucks decided not to play, like at no point were those players, like Giannis is not getting blacklisted from the NBA forever. Like WNBA players don't have that level of protection that the NBA players experience, yet they go above and beyond when it comes to
they went after an owner.
Issues. Right. And they may not get her reelected as a result.
Right. Right. So. And that's not, the WNBA needs all of the credit for laying this blueprint, right? This framework for how we are now seeing athlete activism play out. And you could take it either way. On the one hand, WNBA players don't have the same protection, as you said. On the other hand, you could say that they don't have as much to lose. But I think either way, just the courage and what Jessica said about the organizing, like organizing is hard. Nobody really knows how to do this. And I give the Milwaukee Bucks a lot of credit for going out there and basically just saying that even if they didn't have a set plan for that night, they knew that something was wrong. They wanted to do something about it. And then they immediately asked the questions. They didn't leave the locker room until they got the Wisconsin Attorney General on the phone. And they were like, what can we actually do about this? And he said, and they came out with a plan to ask the state legislature to come back into session to vote on a police reform bill that had been introduced back in June. Like, this is really incredible action that we're seeing that very much started with what the WNBA showed us athletes can do in a real tangible way.
Absolutely. So now shifting, we've kind of touched on it a little bit, but shifting over to the book now. So again, loving sports when they don't love you back. What you all kind of tackle here, and we'll get into sort of what motivated you guys to write this, but tackling sort of the tension between being a sports fan and the sports industry not necessarily always being fair trade certified, or however you want to describe it. You talk about the anti-LGBTQ, you talk about the lack of diversity in terms of sex, you talk about racist mascots. Here I am in Cleveland. Unfortunately, we still have one, so first of all, what was the motivation behind writing the book? Let's start there.
It's interesting that you asked about what it's like being a woman in this industry, because that was very much the motivation of writing this book. Jessica and I met over Twitter. Fun fact, we did not meet in person until we had actually signed a book deal together. But the community of women in sports media is very strong for as small as it might be. And we all have similar frustrations. We all go through the same thing. We all roll our eyes at the same things that happen on Twitter or the same pieces that get published. So, I think it was around the time of the Super Bowl. It's a little bit hard to pinpoint, but I think it was around the time of the Super Bowl one year. And you get all of these pieces, mostly for men, which are or mostly for women, I'm sorry, about how to survive a Super Bowl party, or like how to talk football with your boyfriend, and how to, there's always like 5 major talking points that will be easy for women that they presume don't know anything about sports to memorize, and then like a recipe for dip for your party, right? And I just remember it was just enough of that. And Jessica, there was one that was going around. We were just like, this is, what are we still doing here? How is this still a thing? So the initial idea for the book was a snarky response, frankly, out of immense frustration, out of years of being told that we don't exist as knowledgeable sports fans and not having media catered to us. We were going to write a snarky response, basically a how-to guide of how to date the guy who knows nothing about sports, or how to sit through a Super Bowl game when someone's trying to mansplain third and long to you. And Jessica's got a particularly close association with this because Jessica's husband is not a sports fan.
Yes. So I met my husband when I was a freshman at Florida State in the spring. And the story about this is I was like, oh, have you been to any football games? And he had not. And I couldn't I just didn't understand that. Like, why are you here? And so I always joke, we've been together now for a very long time. And I always joke that the most romantic thing he's ever done is learn how to watch tennis with me. I love watching tennis. And so he has learned to enjoy that sport alongside me so that I'm not alone in my fandom. So yeah, this idea, and if we're at a party or something and sports comes up and they direct it at him, he doesn't want to talk about it. He's just like, please go talk to my wife. Like, I don't even want to pretend with you. It's just not what he cares about at all. So this idea of how women are just not sports fans and can't be imagined that way. Yeah, like Kavitha said, super frustration. We took it to University of Texas Press. We have a great editor, Casey Cottrell, and he like massaged it into this much more serious and thought out project that the book became. But that is absolutely where it started.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that's I remember or recall seeing those little polls that go around, and when you mentioned the dip, like that was a real thing. Like I remember seeing that, like, and I remember saying like that, like you don't even look at that stuff. It almost feels like satire, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I can imagine, sort of where that would have you situated, mentally. But like,
well, it's not to say that those women don't exist, and it's totally fine to be a woman who doesn't love sports. It's just the fact that those of us who do, I think that we also have to realize that women think that they're not supposed to love sports. I remember growing up, I grew up in the mid 2000s. Like it wasn't really that long ago. And I would have female friends who were like, why do you love sports so much? This is not a girly thing to do. I'm like, well, people are more well-rounded than that. I think when women think it's okay to love sports, they really do love sports more.
Like my daughter, she doesn't play, but she's the biggest sports consumer in our family. Like she knows the schedules, the people, and I'm like falling out of the loop in terms of like the NBA players because I'm not like in it, so I don't know the younger guys. So it's really me and my wife talk about it some because like my wife is a big sports person. Like she put me in my place in college when I thought I was introducing her to basketball. Then I met her mother. And my mother-in-law was like one of these literal Sunday through Friday. She knew every game schedule. Don't call me. So it was really interesting watching them. And then now having like my daughter go through this experience where she doesn't want to play. She'll tell me straight up, Dad, I do not want to play, but I want to go to this game. I want to watch this. She's keeping stats. So that's really an interesting dynamic that you bring up because, I think a lot of times we assume, right, that it's the guy that's introducing sports. But like even me, as a male, we say all the time, like when we find a guy that isn't in the sports, we're like, dude, like what do you do then?
Like, what's wrong with you, right?
Yeah,
I feel like my husband just embraced it. Like he's just like, I'm not doing this with you. But he's like prepared for it, right? Because that's sort of how people react to him. It's pretty funny.
The other side of that is like I met Martellus Bennett at the Super Bowl this past year. It was February. It feels like it was 10 years ago. And he will tell you he doesn't like football. He straight up does not like football. Right. He played it. He was good at it. He made a good living from it. It was his job.
Plenty of people don't like their jobs.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, we got Myles Garrett here in Cleveland. He's talked about it before too. He even talked about how he might have retired after the whole helmet thing. In terms of what actually made it into the book, so like I already touched on, like racist mascots, pretty big one, stadium subsidies and things like that, how sports franchises tend to get access to tax dollar money on a fairly regular basis. How did that process come together in terms of which elements of sport you wanted to tackle? Because there are certainly plenty of flaws in the sports industry.
My memory of it, which could be wrong, but my memory of it is that we just kind of created a master list between us of stuff that we thought was important, that we should cover, things that we care a lot about, that we have trouble with as fans, tensions that we feel all the time when we're watching. It was certainly, I think there's 14 chapters in the book, right, Kavitha? And it was going to be longer. There were other things that we just didn't have time. Book writing takes a long time and it's hard work. And so there's some stuff that didn't make in the end, but we felt like we had covered enough ground. I mean, there's still stuff like I could list to you right now that I wish was in the book. And so a lot of it just came out of our own experiences as sports fans and things that we knew other people struggled with once they were conscious or conscientious of any of this stuff.
Yeah, and I think that some of these issues were also, they were things that, like Jessica said, we had felt ourselves, that we had come across in just doing our own work. Like, Jessica's very well known, as she said, in covering gendered violence in sports, and I've done some of that work as well. So like that was an obvious chapter to put in there. And then me having a business background, I'm always thinking about, the finances of things and how that's impacting the way that we experience sports. And then, there were a couple of chapters I think that came across just from having conversations with other fans and realizing what people were thinking and feeling about certain of these dilemmas. And there are a couple of chapters that I wish like we hadn't actually written. And we had a whole chapter planned on what it was like to be a Black NASCAR fan when there were Confederate flags flying in the stands. And we didn't get around to writing that. And thankfully, obviously now that would have been slightly obsolete. But there's so many of these that we don't, Jessica's always bringing up, we don't talk about disabled athletes at all in this book, and we should have. But I feel like this is a jumping off point for these kinds of conversations that people can hopefully have among themselves about the stuff that they're conflicted about as well.
Right. Do you think about the levels below? So in terms of like grassroots sports, and do you guys delve into that world? Because that's personally, so I mean, I'm not saying I'll never return to the professional ranks, but I'm not a big fan of, coaching and things at the professional level, because I think it's more management of attitudes and personalities and, dealing with, the diva mindset that exists amongst pro athletes. And then, obviously at the collegiate level, I feel like is exploitation. And then the level below that is like the grassroots space. But I'm just curious about how much insight you have into that world, because I'll give you one point of view from my perspective, and I'm not involved in women's sports at the grassroots level, but the sense of feeling that men have to control sports at every wake and turn is very evident in youth women's sports. And for me as a man, I have a problem with that. So, if I walk into a gym and they're like, hey, D, come check out this, this girls' camp has got, whatever, the top 100 high school girls. And there's literally like 3 women coaches on the floor and the rest are men, the directors men. How do you address that? Because, I'm looking at it from an aesthetics point of view and I'm like, okay, that just can't be the dynamic in this environment, regardless of competency, right? Like that dynamic needs to change. But how do you address that space as you look at the professional world, sort of the collegiate space and then the grassroots space?
I'll say in the book, it's mainly collegiate and professional. And I think that's mainly because that's where the money is. So a lot of the tensions that people feel within sport has to do with capitalism, frankly. And so you see it more on the, I was trying to think as you were talking, like where I definitely know that in the CTE chapter, we talk about youth football, because that's one thing I wish I would have emphasized that part of it more. I would say in the LGBTQ plus chapter is actually where most of the stuff that I remember writing about grassroots stuff is, because that's a community that has really had to, outside of the sports structure that exists, they have really had to create almost from the ground up. I mean, they created their, the gay games, which is basically the equivalent of the Olympics. So there's entire structures there. I definitely know we covered coaches. So like coaching pipelines and the way that there aren't women in them a lot of the time, which is a really fascinating part of it, because you get a lot of female players who don't actually experience having female coaches for most of their career. So they're not even used to that, right? So the idea of imagining themselves, I feel like that's changing. It's
that's to me a similar thing to when we were talking earlier about whether as journalists we feel pressured to cover women's sports, because frankly not until recently has there been a lucrative career path for a woman to coach women's sports, right? And even then those lucrative jobs have been going to the men to make the money there, right? So I think at the grassroots level though, I mean Jessica's right, we don't cover a lot of these things at the grassroots or youth level, but you can extend a lot of these things that we've talked about into that. I mean, especially if you're talking about, some of the the warrior mentality, the way that weakness is kind of exploited to the ends of exploiting athletes at the professional and college level, that obviously starts at the youth level for the athletes that they've identified as having a path toward possibly, scholarships and being professionals. So I think a lot of that does exist. I mean, a lot of it exists. I think that some of the grassroots stuff you can definitely take from the Olympics chapter. The way that like U.S. sports is organized can be extremely exploitative as well, and obviously doesn't provide the kind of protections we would hope for the safety of our athletes who are young and in those ranks. So yeah, I mean, I think that so many of these problems are broad, systemic, are problems with our society. Like you can extend them not just to the grassroots level of sports, but you can extend them to any system of entertainment. You can say that you have similar issues with music and movies and Hollywood and that kind of thing. So, but you do add an extra layer when it's grassroots, when these aren't athletes who are making money because of it, right? They're not workers. And we talk about that a lot with the college stuff, is that, like these are athletes who should have their own agency, but they're not making economic decisions. These decisions are being made for them.
I think a lot about, was it last year, 2 years ago? I can't remember again. Lindsay Gibbs, who's a friend of mine, a co-host on the podcast that I do, she wrote a piece where she interviewed Muffet McGraw, the head coach at the time at Notre Dame. And Muffet said, "I only hire women." And people lost their minds.
Remember that
she would, right. And she's like, "But look around, like it's all men." And so just her suggesting that was so threatening to so many people. You can see how entrenched the system is, that idea. And the other thing I'll just mention about this is the great paradox of Title IX. Title IX is so important, right? Where women's sports are in the US, and the effect that it's then rippled out to the rest of the world has been incredibly important. It also basically destroyed female coaching, right? So when it was an intramural or JV kind of thing, there were tons of women in coaching. And then as soon as it became as soon as you start to professionalize anything, the men show up. I mean, that's just kind of the way. And so and as it's gotten bigger and bigger as time has gone, more men keep showing up, because that's where now there is money, there's prestige, there's all these other things. So that's as great as Title IX has been, and has really created just a generations of girls and women who participate and play in sports and know so much more about it. It's also made it more lucrative, and therefore the coaching positions that you're talking, men see them as something worth taking.
Taking.
Touching on something that Kavitha brought up that I don't think a lot of people realize when it comes to the U.S. sports versus global sports, is the lack of a department of sport within our government structure. So a department of sport, or some variation on that name, exists in almost every country. And there's actually codified sports law. Sports law in the US is just an aggregation of a bunch of different practice areas. It's not, it may sound sexy, but it's not really anything special. It's just applying contract law to people in sports. So, whereas I think back to Brazil, it's called Lex Sportiva, and they actually have specific laws specific to sports that govern participation.
Sports ministry, right?
I mean, the UK has an entire member of parliament who is an elected member of parliament who is the minister of sports. And I don't know who that person is right now, but a couple of years ago, it was a woman who basically said, "We have a civic duty to put women's sports on television as the country of the United Kingdom." It was a pretty incredible thing. Cory Booker, actually, we had Cory on our show last year, and when he was running for president, and he had made it part of his platform. He wanted to establish a sports ministry, essentially a centralized governing body, to bring in all of these issues that we talk about with youth sports, but also the stuff that we talk about with professional sports, FCC blackouts, all kinds of things that currently do actually get legislated, but not in a centralized way. And I think it would be a fascinating experiment. The difficulty there is that, Americans in particular think that you're taking away their freedoms, you're taking away the business freedom of those things, you're socializing them when you bring them under a centralized body, even when that might not necessarily be the case, because frankly, all of these leagues that we're talking about got to the profitability that they are at because of heavy government subsidies and antitrust exemptions.
Yeah, we have a whole chapter on how it's not just that sports are political, but there are politics in sport. And the thing that's interesting that interrupting you, but like Brazil and the UK, that's so fascinating. I hadn't actually thought about the fact that they have sports ministries. Those two countries just made pay equal for their women's and men's soccer teams. The US has yet to do that. And the one thing that's super interesting about that is that that the UK and Brazil in the 20th century, yes, people don't know this. A lot of people don't know this. They actually banned women's soccer. Like it was illegal to play women's soccer in those two countries. And so that's interesting, the fact that they have now made it to equal pay before we have.
Yeah. Okay. So another thing that more so with Jessica here than Kavitha, unless I'm forgetting a favorite of your sports teams, the struggle of supporting a team whose branding and or mascot is racist. Like for me, even though I was born in Virginia, grew up a Cleveland sports fan, something I've struggled with when it comes to the Indians, especially with Chief Wahoo. You tackle this in the book. I know this is something that's commonly argued. It's argued maybe not in my direct household, but in familial households. Describe that tension and like the reckoning that's finally coming here in the country, where we're starting to address some of the, frankly, white fragility that's kept these things alive. But anyway, I want to turn it over to you, especially as someone who grew up a Florida State fan and went to Florida State and have probably experienced similar things.
Yeah, indeed. So back in March, the book was going to print. March, right, Kavitha?
March.
The book was about to go to print when the whole world shut down for COVID. And there's 2 paragraphs in the introduction where we address COVID and the fact that when the book comes out, we do not know where sports will be. And we were terrified, frankly, that for lots of reasons that the book would be old, that it would be wrong, that it would be insensitive, like that sports were the least important thing at this moment, that all these people are dying. The only chapter that's old by the time, I would say, the only one that's old by the time the book actually published was the one on racist mascots, and for the right reason. But we ended that chapter by saying the Washington NFL team will never change its name. And so we were wrong, thankfully, because we're advocating within that chapter that this needed to happen. And the thing about it is that Native and Indigenous people in Cleveland is a great example of this, have for 40 to 50 to 60 years been out protesting physically these mascots, right? They're telling us constantly. And then on top of it, there's studies that are done that not only do they make Native and Indigenous people feel worse about themselves, but they make white people feel better about themselves, right? And so that's part of why it's hard to go of it. And the women that I interviewed for that chapter were all Native women. And the thing I think they all said this in some version, that there's this idea that this is our tradition, right? This is what sports fans say, this is our tradition that goes back decades. And they're like, our traditions go back thousands of years.
Right.
This isn't equal here. And so it is it's interesting. I directly wrote about Florida State in the book because I, again, grew up in a family that cared very much about that mascot and that team. And I bought it. I bought that it was, we were honoring the Seminole tribe, that the school was making a good effort to include them and all this sort of stuff. And I don't buy it anymore. And one of the things over the last 5 years or so is that I've gotten rid of all the stuff in my house that had this mascot face on it, which I think they've changed it recently, but for most of my life, it was a white man. It was a white man's profile that they had painted red. And that alone just tells you enough about sort of what's wrong here. But that was a hard thing to admit to myself because I felt bad. I was implicated in that. I had justified to myself and to other people that this was okay. And it's actually way more complicated because I'm sorry, I could just talk about this too much, but because of the history of the violence and the genocide that the American government has done, not just citizens, but the government themselves, that it has done to Native and Indigenous people. It split the Seminole tribe, right? So there are still Seminoles who live in Florida, but there's a bunch that live in Oklahoma. And that is violence that was done to them by the government. And they don't all agree, right? And so it's much more complicated than the school or even the Seminole tribe of Florida often will admit to, because they have relationships with the state, they have casinos, it's complicated. And I just think we should all err on the side of not being racist. I don't know. And so, this is where I've ended up over the last, personally, and I get why people feel implicated in it, but they should. The history is so terrible. And as soon as you start scratching at that surface at all, you realize how horrific, in particular, the United States of America has been to Native Indigenous people, like the least we can do is just get rid of these mascots that uphold so much of that history.
Yeah, I don't have a personal fandom of a team that has a mascot or a name based on a Native American person or tribe. But I've always tried to like think of what would happen if someone tried to change the name of my team for whatever reason. Like, what if they had to be like not the Yankees, but I don't know. Well, they were originally the Highlanders, but I think that when you talk to fans about why that's so difficult for them, I think part of it is exactly what Jessica said. It's, they feel implicated. They don't want to confront that they've participated in this part of supremacy and violence. And the other side of it is a through line in the book. It really attacks their own personal identity as fans of these teams. Like, they don't know what it will look like to be a fan of the Washington team when they have a new mascot and a new name. And it speaks to just the rattling of what they've always conceptualized themselves of as fans. It's a similar thing to, we interviewed a bunch of fans for the chapter on stadium subsidies. The threat of your team to leave your city was really like horrifying to so many fans, even when it was an empty threat, even when it was costing you like half of your state school system budget. It was really something like fans understood to some level how irrational that was, that they had that fear or that they couldn't let go of that part of their identity, but they really couldn't. And I think that stronghold that sports has on us on an individual basis is what allows these systemic things to continue to be upheld.
Yeah, you couldn't mention the name Cleveland Browns in my household for a chunk of years of my childhood. We talked about this with Patrick Ruby, and I forget the exact context. I think it was around concussions and women's sports as well. So I think it was investment in women's sports, but there's also just a business part of this where it's like the Cleveland Indians are now down to a block C. Like, how marketable is a red C? Mm-hmm. Like, really, how much do you really get out of that as a brand value, or as far as brand value goes?
There's a fascinating brand value conversation to be had here. On the one hand, I mean, the easy route to go is how much more merchandise, how much brand new merchandise are you about to sell with a new logo, with a new team, with, all of that? How much more valuable, sadly, is that going to make the stuff that's now out of circulation also? Because we can look back on it as being historic relics and historic artifact instead of what it will probably continue to be among the fans who will wear those jerseys, which is like their statement that they are not, succumbing to like PC culture or the system. But on the other hand, this is just something that teams go through even when they don't have a racist mascot, right? I mean, we literally have the Tampa Bay Rays in the World Series right now, and they've got these revamped jerseys. They're not the Devil Rays anymore. This is just something that brands do, that teams do, and I would encourage everyone actually to, one of my colleagues, the legendary David Aldridge, wrote a piece about this when the Washington team dropped its name, about exactly what the process is for a team to rebrand, because obviously we've done this with the Washington Bullets as well. Like, we have done this throughout sports. This isn't something that is totally unprecedented. And if the thing that's making this be done isn't because your marketing team did a focus group and told you that blue is a better color for your team than red, but it's that, Indigenous people are telling you that their entire history is being erased here. I mean, this is absolutely something that we can do.
And I just want to say, since we're having this conversation, I think it's really important. What the Washington NFL team did was good, and they should have done it a lot earlier, but it's good that they did it. But that's not the end. And I think on some level, when there's such a, that was the worst version of it. And so it feels like a real victory where we can be like, and we did it, and we are done. And we are not done. I mean, we're talking about Cleveland here. We can talk about Kansas City or FSU or the fact that the fact that there are something like 80 high schools in America that still use the R word as their high school mascot, right? Like there's plenty of space for this. Right. This change needs to keep happening. Like, we can't just all feel really good about the Washington NFL team finally capitulating mainly because of money and outside pressure. Like, on some level, it feels like we need to really, as a society, have a discussion about how long it took and why it has taken that long. Because it's really disappointing when you think of it from that way, and the fact that there is still so much change that needs to happen on this front.
None of us are under the pretense that Dan Snyder just had to come to Jesus moment and realize that this was a thing. This was FedEx, Pepsi, and Nike.
I was going to say FedEx, right? Like, you got FedEx putting pressure, so of course things are going to move.
Right.
Yep. Exactly.
And And touching on something Kavitha brought up there, the amusing thing is like the Devil Rays teams gets changed. There was a push at one point for like the New Jersey Devils to change their name. It speaks a lot about the country that once Christianity gets involved, some things can get changed. But when racism's involved, then again the white fragility part comes into it. So anyway, David, you want to do? We've already held you guys over. I don't want to take up too much of your time.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, I've got one simple question. So I just believe in you guys have achieved a lot in your young lives. You've had different success moments and different points. What a part of your everyday routine, like, do you think sort of fortifies you from day to day? Like, what is it that you do on a consistent basis? Maybe it's something you started doing in high school or college, or what is it that fortifies you to give you that, okay, this is how we're going to keep this upward tick. We're going to continue to inspire people, write, get a book published. What is it that you do every day that sort of fortifies you and gives you that sense of routine?
Wow. I feel like I'm in therapy right now. I feel like this is like when I talk to my therapist about
this
too
is
much.
When you find out that I'm like I live a life of chaos and have
I know, I was like,
routine.
Yes,
I do anything.
I love the chaos characters that we have.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I recently was in therapy and I said, I'm doing really well right now. And she's like, how do you know that this is very well? And I was like, I don't know the answer to that. So one thing, and this is not something I have not done anything the same since high school. I feel like I'm about to turn 40 and that I'm still figuring out on a day-to-day basis, like how to maintain something that I started a few years ago. They call them bullet journals, but mine is not. Like, those can be super fancy things and mine is not. But every Sunday night I sit down and I have a journal, and for one day a week. So a day for Monday, for Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And I go through and I write like this thing we're doing right now is in my bullet journal as a thing that I was doing today. And what's good about it is it's a to-do list and I can cross things off, which is good for my anxiety. But I also, when I do something not on the list, I get to write it down and it gets on there too. So I'm sure y'all will understand, like, I often feel like I have done nothing. I get to the end of the day and I'm like, I did nothing today. And then I will make myself sit there with the journal and write like, well, what did I actually do? Oh, well, I talked to this person on the phone for 45 minutes. I actually was in this meeting. I did laundry in the meantime. I made dinner. I got my kid to school and back. Like, I write all those things down and then I'm able to look at them and just show myself, honestly. I lie to myself a lot about, and often in negative ways. So that's been something over the last 4 or 5 years that has really helped me. Sorry to bring up my therapist so much, but honestly, one way that she got me to understand when I can tell when I'm not doing well is I'll stop writing in the journal. And so if you flip through my journal, there'll be like a week missing. And you'll be like, oh, Jessica was off that week. Like she wasn't putting the pieces together every day. So that's been something that's helped. So if I feel like I'm struggling, the most basic thing that I will do is make myself fill out that journal.
Right.
I think for me, it's not like anywhere near as organized or motivational. But I've got two friend threads. I've got a WhatsApp thread and I've got a group text. One is from my neighbors in like this community that I've managed to build over the last 7 years in the part of New York that I live in. And the other is our like very cheeky, very snarky college-based fantasy football league, where there's a lot of like smack talking and a lot of inside jokes for the poor. Like there's 2 spouses on the thread who did not go to our college, so I feel really bad for them. And it's like, if you've seen that Netflix show Friends from College, it's like that, but we're not horrible people. Plus the league, and I feel like but having like literally like we talk on these threads 8-9 times a day. I've gotten 4 texts from them the time that we've been doing this podcast, and having people just check in on you and just want to like talk. Usually it's just talking sports, and then we'll probably talk politics here and there and everything, and we all like know each other extremely well in that way. But having that like reinforcing thing that, it reinforces for me that like I'm still the person in my friend circle who is like the sports person, even though there are tons of sports fans. And I think also just having just having people keep you on your toes. Like, it's really nice. Like, one of our friends is an, Dublin born fan of Detroit sports, because his wife is from Detroit, and just having like the things that he's thinking about, right? Like what questions he's having that will never be questions that I have about sports, right? Are the things that continue to like motivate me to ask questions and to do things and to read. So
Wow.
shout out to the Lions Den.
Those are great. Those are great answers. And I asked that question again because I just believe that people have routines, and even if they're orthodox or unorthodox routines, I think we can all benefit from learning sort of what makes each other tick, and what things we do on our daily basis, weekly basis, monthly basis to help fortify us. So that's all I got. I appreciate the time. We enjoyed this conversation. It was awesome.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you both so much. Be sure to check out Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back. And then also Kavitha on The Lead and Jessica on the Burn It All Down podcast. You can hear from them plenty more.
Burn It All Down. I like that.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for the most recent episode of Forward Thinking, presented by the Professional Collegiate League, featuring Kavitha Davidson and Jessica Luther. Forward Thinking is co-hosted by David West and Ricky Vellante, produced by Rafa Hernandez Brito, Wendell Haskins, and Ricky Vellante, and the music is done by David West. If you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe Forward Thinking on your favorite podcast platform and the PCL YouTube channel. You can also get more information at thepcleague.com/forwardthinking. We'll see y'all next week, and in the meantime, stay safe.